All right, so what I'm going to do today, I decided to call a bit of an audible today. I'm going instead of going into ER diagrams today, I think I'm going to do the advanced SQL portion first because that maintains some continuity. And also, I have some observers coming in next week to watch me teach you guys. And I thought it might be more interesting for them if I did the ER diagrams then for them because they might understand that better, having not seen the intermediate SQL portion. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do advanced SQL. And I'm going to show you how we integrate SQL into a Java program. So we're going to be working with Java a little bit today. And JDBC, let me share my screen. But first, we'll talk a little bit about how SQL works in the context of Java. And bear with me a second. I got to make sure I've got the right thing here. Okay, good. Yeah, this is the right one. All right, so let's get into advanced SQL with Java. And here are the slides. So when you're integrating SQL with Java, you do it is you establish a connection with the database, and then you form a query in Java. You essentially build a string with the query in Java. And then you send that string to the SQL database. So, essentially you'll be forming those SQL statements in Java, building them in Java using some libraries that JDBC provides. JDBC is the Java database interface. And, that's what's used to send the SQL command to Java or to the database via Java. And the other thing that you're going to do is you're going to manage any exceptions that occur as a result of trying to issue that statement. And you're going to handle those exceptions. And then you're going to retrieve the results. You're going to retrieve what's called the metadata associated with the results. So we're going to show some of that. So, let's get started. Let me show you what this program looks like here. So here I have a program in Java. I'm calling it JDBC Basic SQL Server. It's a class that I've created here. And basically what this thing is going to do, the first thing this thing is going to do is it's going to try to establish a connection with the SQL Server database. So, this is a standard connection string. The port that SQL Server uses is port 1433 on the system. So the first part of the, I'm sorry, we're still in the presentation mode here. Can you get out of that? So the port that the SQL Server uses is port 1433. So that's the first part. Oh gosh. There's remnants today. We're having all kinds of technical. Are okay. You're seeing the right things, but the people in the room just lost the video. Okay. So let me make this larger. All right, but the port that we're connecting to on the SQL Server host, on the SQL Server is 1433. So the first part of the connection statement says that we're using JDBC, we're using the Java database interface, and we're connecting on port 1433, which is the SQL Server, the port that the SQL Server runs on. The next thing we tell the connection string is what database we're going to be running against. And in this case, I'm going to be running a query against the grades database that runs on our SQL server. So you'll see the database name equals grades there. And I've established a user and password on the database. The username is JDBC user, and the password I've set up for that user is Wombat6. So if we go to the database here, for example, and we go to security, and we go to logins, you'll see that we have a JDBC user that I've provisioned there. And I've set up a password of Wombat6 for that JDBC user. And that's so that I can run this SQL query from Java. Okay. So what I do is I set up that and I try that connection because if that fails, I want to give an error message and dump the stack. So, at the bottom, if I have any exceptions that occur, I'm going to dump the stack and show that there was an error. Otherwise, so we have a try here, and we have a catch down below that will catch the exception if it doesn't work. Otherwise, we're going to say, if we get a connection back, that we're connected to the database. And if we don't get a connection back, then we did not connect properly to the database. Okay, so you'll see that at the beginning when I run this. You'll see, connect to SQL Server and demo select. You'll see that prints out here, and connected to the database prints out because we successfully made that connection. All right, so at this point, I'm just connected to the database. I haven't done anything yet. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this Java program an argument. And the argument that I'm going to give this Java program is going to fill in this question mark right here. So, the question mark here, I've built a select statement here. I'm using a string builder library call to build the select statement. And what I'm doing is I'm selecting star from student data, where last, like, and I'm leaving a placeholder for what it's going to be like. Because I want to be able to essentially put in an argument to this program. So here's my arguments. And you can see that I'm putting a W% in here. So that argument will be used in place of that question mark. And the place that that's done is right here. I set the argument to, I build that statement and I set the argument or the question mark to the argument in the Java program. Okay. So I will do that there. And when I run the statement, here's where I execute the statement. I do an execute query. By the way, these are all library calls in the JDBC library. When I run that query, it returns a result set. So you'll see that here, and the result set class is a class also that's defined in that JDBC library. So I get that result set back. And along with that result set, I get metadata back. Sorry, Michael had a question. Bear with me a second. Well, guys, am I sharing my screen yeah, I am sharing my screen. Michael's question. Yeah, so we're going against the database using SQL, right, Michael? But we're writing that SQL in Java. That's exactly right. And we're using the JDBC libraries to do that. Okay. So we build this string, and we try to execute that string. Or we prepare the statement first. We prepare the statement using prepare statement. And then we execute that statement. To prepare the statement, all we're doing is we're substituting for the first question mark. We're setting that first string, that first question mark, to be the argument of this Java program. Okay. And then we execute that statement. And when we execute that statement, we capture the result set. And that result set also includes metadata that tells what's contained in that result set. So for example, we're doing a select star here. When we do a star, we don't know, unless we know the specification of that student data table, we don't know what fields that star is going to return, right? We don't know what set of fields constitutes student data. So when we have a star there, it could be returning anywhere from one field to, 100 fields, depending on how that table is defined. So we've got to capture the metadata that will tell us how many fields are involved in the result set that comes back from that query. Does anybody have any questions on that? Does that make sense? So our result set tells us through the metadata, through the get metadata for that result set, how many columns have been returned by that select query. And, that's through the get column count procedure here. Okay. So you guys are going to have this program. I'm going to provide this program on our Canvas page. So you can use it as a model. So you're not going to have to necessarily memorize all of these library commands and things like that. This will give you a nice template that you can use for your JDBC programs. And you will have an assignment to write a JDBC program following the assignment that you're currently working on intermediate SQL. All right, so the metadata associated with that, we get the metadata associated with the result set, and that tells us the number of columns. So what we want to do for each column is we want to print out each element of each column. And then when we're done with the record, we'll print a new line so that we can print out each element of each column of the next record and the next record and the next record. Right? So we get the number of columns. And while we have new records, as long as we have new records, we're going to print out each column of the record until we get to the next record. Then we're going to print out each column of the next record separated by a comma. Then we're going to do the same for the next record and the next record. How are you guys with this? Anybody? Are you guys, I know you guys have taken some programming classes. Is this Java format familiar to you? Are you recognizing these loops and the for statements and things like that? Or is this totally out of left field for you? So okay, good, thanks. So the string builder command is a library, a method that's included in the JDBC library. And what it does is it allows us to substitute, it allows us to build a string that has these question marks in it. And then it gives us a method called prepare statement that lets us use setString to substitute for each of those question marks. So, if this had multiple question marks in it, I would do a setString1 with the first value, a setString2 with the next value, etc. And that would be how I would prepare this statement. Okay. Once the statement is prepared, then we execute that statement. And the way we execute that statement is by calling the execute query method for a statement. And we capture the values that are returned by that statement in a result set object. Okay. The result set object includes a method that gives the metadata that's associated with that result set. So the number of columns, all that good stuff is returned in the metadata for that result set, and that can be accessed by the get metadata method. And then we can use that metadata in order to print out the result set, because we know how many columns we have to print for each record. So the result set next gets each successive record. And by using the for loop that goes from 1 to the number of columns, which we got through the column count here from the metadata, we can print out the result here. Okay. So here it is, here's how we do a prepare statement. Let me put this on the big screen here for you. This prepare statement is an insert into instructor, and here it's giving 4 values that it's going to insert into instructor. And then it uses the set string or set int to set each of those 4 values depending on the type that's being inserted. Okay. And then it executes the statement. And then it can set a new value for the string, and it can execute it again. Okay. Okay. So that's essentially how a prepare statement works. You build the SQL query, you put in parameters for things that you want to, essentially set later on. And those parameters are represented by question marks. And then you use the set string or set integer to replace those parameters with values. Okay. I'm going to get into this SQL injection in just a moment. There's a cautionary tale here. All right. Let me get back to that. All right. So when the result comes back, as I said, you can get the metadata about those results, like the count of the columns. And you can get each column name as well through the column name method for the metadata. And you can also get the type of each column with the column type name method for that metadata. Okay. And you guys are going to have an opportunity to use some of these methods in your homework assignment. Okay. In addition to the query metadata, there's also database metadata that you can retrieve, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So let me get back to my program example here. All right, so I've set this up so that I can replace that question mark with whatever argument I put in the SQL statement. So if I want, for example, to get the records from student data where the last name begins with the letter C, I can just go in and change my argument here and change that from W% to C%. And then I'll run that, and I have the same query. And now it's just returning those. Oh, thank you. Keep doing that. Sorry about that. All right, share. All right, so yes, Hannah, you'll have access to these slides for the lesson on Canvas. Actually, they should already be there. I'll double check to make sure they're accessible. Let's see. Oh, I didn't publish. Okay, there we go. These slides are available right here on Canvas for lesson 6. Okay, so if I want to I've got this question mark in here in my query, and it's substituting the first argument of my Java program for that question mark. So if I want to get all the names, instead of getting all the names that begin with W, originally I had a W% here. If I set that argument equal to W%, I'm going to get the names that begin with W, and here they are: White, Williams, Wilson, Williams, etc. If I want to change that to now get the names that begin with the letter S, let's say, I can change that argument to be S% instead of W%, and I can run that program. And now it returns all the names that begin with S rather than W. Okay. So this string builder is a nice way of building parameterized queries. And if this were an insert statement, I could use it to insert new records based on the values of the arguments in my program. So we could demonstrate that as well. But that's how string builder works and prepare statement. We build that string, and then we use prepare statement to substitute for the question marks one by one in the string. Everybody good with this so far? All right. So in addition to the the result set returns, and we can get the metadata from the result set that contains the number of columns and contains the name and type of each column in the result set. So, for example, you guys are going to be doing this for homework, so I don't want to do too much here. But I can put a system out print here. Dot. The column name J. And we could run that. Yeah, sorry, hang on. My syntax here. Oh, get column. Okay, sorry. Get column name. Look up the proper syntax for that. Bear with me 1 second. Let's get the column name. Copy and make sure I got it. I'll have to look that up. Well, here we have it. We'll use it here. So here we have print get column name result get string. So let's do that. And you'll see that it puts the column name and then the string there, the value of the column. Oh, I see. I called it RSMD. I'm sorry. RSMD, that's why it's not working. There we go. Okay. So you can see it puts the let's put a separator there. That out, print. Put a colon in between the column name. So here it shows the ID is 37, the last is Scott, the first is Ella, the gender is female, and the class is CSIT 213. Great. Right, so that's how the get column name function works, and this is all returned in the metadata, which is gotten via the get metadata command right here. Okay. Any questions on that or any comments? When I publish this, I'm not going to include that get column name because you guys are going to do that as part of your assignment. All right. So the other thing we can get using JDBC is we can get information about the database itself. So here, Hannah has a question. Shouldn't it be J less than or equal to get column count in the for loop? No, I'm setting J to be the number of columns that's returned. So the number of columns that's returned is cols, which is set to the get column count, which comes back from the metadata. And the reason I do less than is because after the last one, I want to be able to print, I don't want to print a comma after the last column. So I don't want this to say CSIT123-03 with a comma after it. So I stop when it's less than J. And then as I exit the for loop, then I print the last column. Does that make sense, Hannah? So the last column name is actually in this statement, in the print line statement, because I want to do a new line after the last column name rather than putting a comma after the last column name. So good eye and good question, but that's the reason I did less than rather than less than or equal to. Great question. All right, let's see. Okay, good. Okay. All right. So yeah. So generally this is the number of columns is the get column count, and you would process each column out of that get column count. But and I could have made this less than or equals, and gotten rid of this other line here. For Hannah's question, but what would have resulted then I wouldn't have had any new lines in here. I would have just been putting commas and everything would have been appended together. I could certainly And that's not what we wanted for this, so that's why I did it the way I did it. Okay. So after the last column, you do need that. I mean, after the last column, you do need that new line. So that's why I did it the way I did it. And that formats it a little bit better on one record per line. Okay. All right. Let's get to the database metadata. All right. So in addition to getting metadata about your results, you want to get metadata about the database itself. So here I'm going to get the tables information about the grades database. So my database here is the grades database. And I'm going to get all the table names. I'm going to get all the schema names, all that good stuff. So, when I get that, when I use these methods, I can, RS tables gets the table information. It tells what type of table it is. It tells the table category. Let me find it. Okay, so getString table category tells the category of the table. GetString table schema tells the schema type. In this case, these are all DBO schema. These are all database objects. GetString table name gets the table name. Here we have classes, grade ranges, etc. Table type gets the table type. All of these are tables. And remarks get any remarks that are associated with the tables. And we can also get the keys associated with the table. So RS keys gets the keys associated with the table. So here we see the key is graded item ID for graded items table. The key is ID for student data, etc. So, the get tables command gets the metadata or gets table information from the database metadata. Okay, so you'll see this other additional capability in JDBC to get the metadata associated with the connection. That connection is to a particular database. And from that metadata, you can extract information about the various tables that make up that database. Okay, so let's look at the slides on that. So here we have our database metadata. We get that by using a connection get metadata, a metadata method on the connection. And from that, we can get the columns and type and all that good stuff of the various tables in the database. Okay. Get primary keys, get key sequence, all that good stuff. Okay. So I'm going to pause there. Does anybody have any? Let me exit out the slideshow mode here. Does anybody have any questions? So we have three different types of things we're dealing with here. One is the data from a table. One is the metadata associated with the data that's returned by that query. The data from the query, the metadata returned by the query, and then the metadata for the database as a whole. And we have different methods for getting at each of those, all of which are illustrated in this program. Okay, so in the program, we have the data, that's this stuff. The metadata is the things like the number of columns and the names of the columns that let us print this stuff and format it nicely. And the metadata about the database tells us about the tables and the attributes of those tables that make up the database. Okay. So we have queries, query results, query result metadata, and then database metadata, all of which we can get through these various methods in JDBC. All right, so let me just walk through this program one more time, and we're going to go back. I wanted to show you the permissions that I showed you at the end of class, last class. I figured out what the problem was. For some reason, that view was not being created, so I'm going to fix that. But let me walk through this program just one more time, just to make sure that we all know exactly what's going on here and what features of Java or JDBC we're using. All right, Michael had a question. Yeah, why are we learning to write this in Java? Well, the reason we're learning to write this in Java is because you're going to be developing applications for databases. And you're going to have things like forms that you implement in JavaScript and stuff like that. You know, Java or SQL itself is not a procedural language. It doesn't let you do things in order. You know, it doesn't let you. It's a declarative language. It says, this is what I want from the database. Retrieve this. If you want to make that procedural, like have a user type input into a form and then have that form sent to the database, use to update values in that database, then retrieve the updated values and do that kind of sequential type of logic, you need to have a programming language around SQL that will do that stuff for you. So to make that possible, they provide this interface to Java called JDBC, okay? So you will be writing programs around the database that will allow it to do different things. And in order to do that, you need to be able to integrate it with a procedural language like Java. And that's what we're learning today. Does that make sense, Michael? Does that answer your question? Okay, great. All right. Okay. So let's walk through the program just one more time to make sure everybody understands the elements. So the first thing we do is we define what the connection is to the database. And that connection includes the server that we're connecting to and the port on the machine that we're connecting to connect to that server. By default, that's 1433. It includes the name of the database we're going to be working on, which is the grades database. And it includes any information we need to authenticate ourselves to that database. So in this case, I've got a logon that I've set up, JDBC user, and I've set a password for that, and I need to provide both the login and the password so that Java can open that connection. So I try to open that connection. And if I'm successful, I say, yes, I'm connected to the database. And if I'm not successful, I say I'm not connected to the database. The next thing I do is I check to see if this Java program has any arguments. Because if it has an argument, I want to do a query using that argument. Okay? In this particular case, we can look at the run configuration for this query. And we see that this query does have an argument. Okay? It has one argument. So arg's length is greater than or equal to 1 because we have one argument that we're giving to this Java program. So we can start to build our query. So we make this string using string builder. And the string includes this select statement. But this is not a select statement that we can run yet because we put in a placeholder here, a question mark, that we're going to substitute that argument for our program into. Okay? So that's what we're doing in this statement. What we want to do now is we want to try to substitute for that question mark. So we do a prepared statement. We we use the prepared statement type on that connection, and we prepare this string that we created using string builder, and we use the prepared statement set string function to replace that question mark with the contents of our first Java program argument. Okay? And then we try to execute that command. And if we're successful in executing that command, we're doing this, try encompasses this whole thing. If we're successful in executing that command, we retrieve the results in the result set. And then we get the metadata out of that result set using the get metadata method. Thank you. Okay. The metadata tells us for that result set, among other things, how many columns were returned by the query. And that's in get column count. And what we want to do is for each of the columns that's returned by the query, we want to print up, except for the last one, we want to print the contents of that column followed by a comma. And that we can see here up through here. Now for the last column that's returned by that query, the one that where the loop counter reaches the number of columns, we want to print the contents of that column, but we want a new line after that. So that's what we're doing with that last print line. Okay. And we do that for each record. This is within a while loop here's the while loop that reads each record. The next method gets each record. Okay. And that's what returns, that's what prints the results of the query, which are right here. Any questions on that so far? Okay, the next thing I'm doing is I'm printing a line that says database metadata because I wanted to let you know that we're now in a new section of the program. Okay. To get the database metadata, we don't get the metadata from the result set, we get the metadata from the connection. So the connection supports a get metadata method that returns the metadata about the database. Okay, one of the pieces of metadata is tables information. So we're going to get the table information for the grades database. And that's what we're doing here. And here I have a comment. If the null value says we want all table names, all table categories, all table types. By setting these arguments to null, we're getting all of the different table categories and types. And we're going to print that table information now. So we print the table category, which in this case is a grades table. The table schema, most of these are database objects. There are a couple of system tables we also got returned here. The table name, classes, grade ranges, graded items, student data, etc. We print the table name. The table type, each one of these is a table. And any remarks, in this case, all of the remarks are null. And the next thing we want to type or we want to print for each table is we want to get the primary keys for the table. So we get the primary keys for the table name. And for each primary key, we want to print out the key sequence. Now, since both of these tables only have one primary key, there's only one. So there's one primary key. The primary key of graded items is graded item ID. The primary key of student data is ID. So we see those printed out here for those tables. And the rest of these tables have no keys. No keys defined, so we don't see anything after the null remark. Okay. And that's the whole program. So we print out all done at the very end of that. Everybody good with this program now? Any questions on this program? Have I totally lost you? Okay, so you're going to see this program in your in Canvas, and you're going to edit this program. You can edit this program to make changes to make it do some of the things that you need to do. So let me go over. Well, let me do the permissions thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to show you that permissions demonstration that I tried to show you last time. So let me do that first. And then I'm going to go over the things that are going to happen over the next couple of weeks in this class, you know, in terms of your assignments. So relative to permissions, I started to demonstrate this last time. Let me make sure everything is gone here. Yeah, okay, good. All right, we're starting from scratch here. So what I want to do is I want to create a view in my census database. Hang on, let me make sure I'm in my census database first. There we go, census database. All right, I'm going to create that view in my census database that I created the last time. And that is the births view. So here we are, we're going to create a births view in our census database. So the births view is just the births metric out of the population metrics table. You notice I join geographic area with population metrics, and I'm only selecting those metrics that are births, but I'm selecting BIPS number, area, and state from geographic area, metric year, metric name, and metric value from population metrics. But that's how I create the births view. And if I refresh my views now in my database, I'll see that I now have this new view, births view, that is that set of fields from my database for the birth metrics. By the way, the select statement should be very similar to the select statements that you did for this week's homework, but I'll get back into that moment. You know, next class, I'm going to review the homework. But now I've created this births view. What I want to do is I want to create a new role in the database. So let me create that new role. Well, first I'm going to create a new user, jwise2. And I'm going to give that user a password, and I'm going to give that user access to the entire system. So I'll use the master database here. I'm going to create this user jwise2 with the password wombat6, which I've done. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give that user access to the census database. So I'm going to create that user in the census database. So that's what I do here. I've created that user in the census database. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new role in this database that allows people to access only the births view of the database. So I'm going to create this role, births editor. And right now I'm just naming the role. I'm not giving it any permissions yet. I'm just creating it. So this is the command that will create that role in my database. Oh, it already exists. All right, so I've got, let me delete it. I want to start over here. Let's delete that. All right, let's create it now. Create that view, sense that role births editor in the database. I create that role. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to grant the ability to run select commands on births view to that role births editor. So let's do that. And now births editor, anybody who has the births editor role can now just do selects on births view and nothing else. That's all they're allowed to do because that's the only permission that I've granted them. Okay. All right. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add J. Weiss 2 to the births editor role. So there's J. Weiss 2. I'm altering the role births editor to add J. Weiss 2 as a member of that role. So I've done that. So that means J. Weiss 2 now has all the permissions that have been accorded to the births editor role. So let's see that in action. Let's see what happens. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log off as J. Weiss now. And I'm going to log in as J. Weiss 2 instead. And who remembers my password here? It's Wombat6. So I'll type in my password to log on as J. Weiss 2. And now I'm in my census database. So here I am in my census database. Let's try to do something here. Let's try to select star from geographic area. I don't have permission to do that. Now I'm J. Weiss 2. All I have is births editor, the births editor role. So I don't have permission to do that. Okay, well, let's select it from births view then. Let's select star from births view. Let's see if I can do that. Yeah, I can do that because J. Weiss 2 was granted select permission for births view. Okay. Let's see if I can update births view. What do you guys think? You think this is going to work? Who thinks this is going to happen? Raise your hand. Who thinks this is not going to happen? That's right. This doesn't happen because J. Weiss 2 does not have. Oops. J. Weiss 2 does not have update permission as a member of the role births editor. Okay. So let's exit out of here. Okay, and let me log off. And now I'm going to log back on as the administrator, who is J. Weiss, J. Weiss 2 now. I'll log back on as J. Weiss. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my census database and I'm going to grant Let me do it by editing my previous query. I'm going to grant update on births view to births editor now. Okay. And I'll log off. And I'll log back on as J. Weiss 2 with password Wombat6 again. And now I'll go to my census database and I'll update births view. Set and sure enough, I can do that now in births view because I've been granted that privilege. Okay. You can make multiple roles in the database and you can assign multiple roles to the same person. So the same person may have multiple roles in your database. And that's how you administer permissions in the database, is you create these roles, you assign people to these roles, and as long as they're a member of a role that has permission to do something, they will be allowed to do that. If they're not a member of a role that has permission to do something, they will not be allowed to do that. Now, the role that Jay Weiss is a member of that allows me to do all these things, that allows me to control these permissions, is I am a member of the database administrator role. And the database administrator is allowed to set permissions. You guys, when you log on to your SQL Server, use Windows Authentication, you have been configured as a database administrator of your instance of SQL Server. So you will be allowed to do these things also on your instance of SQL Server. Okay? All right. Any questions on permissions? And how permissions are administered in a database? I almost forgot, there's one other thing I wanted to show you. We do that now, and then I'll go into your assignments. Now, some of you who are familiar with Java, notice that we use a string builder command to build the query that we used, that we ran in our program. Now, there are other ways of building strings in Java. And let me show you one of those now. God bless you. Okay. You know, this is essentially the same program that we had before. You know, I do my connection, except this time, instead of using, oh, wait. Instead of using the prepared statement, you know, why did I use prepared statement? Well, instead of using prepared statement here, I'm just going to append the argument 0 to this string. So hopefully you guys can see here, I'm building this string. Instead of using prepare statement, I'm just appending. I'm not using that question mark thing that I did before. I'm just appending the argument by building the string that way. Why would I not want to do this? Why do I use the prepared statement instead of doing this? Does anybody know? Okay, this program works perfectly well. Go to the right run configuration here. This program works perfectly well if the argument I put in there is W%. You know, if I'm nice and I put the right argument in there, I can run this last name or last, I'm sorry, last equals. All right, we'll put in Roberts. Sorry. We'll put in like, okay, like. Here we go. Sorry, we'll make this like, and we'll run this again. Oh, I'm running the wrong program. This is the MySQL version. All right. This program will work perfectly well if I put W% here. So let's run that and see what happens. All right, I need to put the W% in single quotes. There we go. So this program runs perfectly well if I'm nice and I put a W% in there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a hacker here, or I'm going to be mean. And instead of doing that, instead of putting a nice argument in here, I'll put W% or 1 equals 1 as my argument here. Okay? What this is doing is this is making the where clause be where last equals W% or the number 1 equals 1. So when I run this program, you'll see it's not only returning the information for anybody whose name begins with a W, it's returning the information for everybody. Okay, this is something called SQL injection, and it's a way that hackers exploit bad SQL code. And what makes SQL code bad is that instead of using prepare statement, and replacing the parameters, the question mark parameters through the set string command, what people do instead is they build their query by using strings and appending strings together without checking to make sure that the input arguments match, are valid input arguments. Okay. So prepare statement is a library call that's designed to protect against this SQL injection. Okay. But bad programmers have been doing stuff like this for a while. So there are a lot of database systems that are vulnerable to these bad inputs. Yeah.
So if you were to use this, or I mean like the other one, statement, to be able to prevent like a user from pushing in some kind of like drop table statement that would basically just delete everything if you did that.
Yeah. If you do this build string thing instead of doing the prepare statement, you can insert a semicolon and then a new statement, and it'll run that new statement. So you're exactly right. I mean, that you could include a drop table statement in the arguments of this program, and it would drop a table in the database. But if you use prepare statement, it prevents that from happening. And the other thing you guys should be aware of, and I teach this as part of my security classes, is for any input that you guys have in a program, and this is not only true for the database class, but for any Java that you do. For any input that you have for a program, you have to make sure that you're validating that the input that people put in is a good input and what you expect, and not something that you don't expect. That is one of the biggest causes of security problems in programs, or one of the worst programming practices that people do that allows hackers to break programs. Okay, so any input that you ever receive for a Java program, or any program, I should say, Python, anything, you should be validating that input and doing error checking on that input and doing boundary checking on that input to make sure that it's a valid input. Okay, so this was a little bit of a demonstration on why why JDBC implemented this prepare statement rather than just letting you build strings arbitrarily. But there's an abject lesson in here for other programming that you do is always make sure when you allow input to a program, whether it's through command line arguments or through a reading from a buffer or whatever, that you validate that input before you use it. Okay. Those of you who are taking my security class will have to hear this again later on. But this is important for the SQL class because this is something you can do in JDBC, but you should never do it in JDBC. You should always use the prepare statement. And by the way, the prepare statement doesn't let you include question marks for fields. It doesn't let you specify which fields you're going to return. Those you have to know in advance. All it lets you do is essentially specify parameters for where clauses. Doesn't allow you to specify table names because that leads to problems. So prepare statement keeps you from doing dumb things in SQL. Okay? I hope that was useful and interesting and informative. So let me stop there. And before I completely stop, I do want to go over what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks because so let's go to our Canvas page a little bit here. And I'm going to go into student view. So you guys will see exactly what I see, or I'll see exactly what you guys see more appropriately. All right, so the last assignment that you had was due on the 21st, was to query the census database And most of you have handed that in. If you haven't handed that in, you've got until basically the end of tomorrow to do a late assignment, because on Thursday, I'm going to be going over that homework. Okay, so if you haven't handed in the query to the census database and you want even partial credit for it, you better do it by tomorrow, close business tomorrow, because otherwise I'll be going over it and I won't be giving any credit. You've got a new assignment to do intermediate queries. Okay, and those are represented here. Those queries, the requirements for those queries are represented here. So that's due November 2nd. The other thing I want you to keep in mind is you should be getting with your final project groups to figure out what data sets you're going to use and what your group responsibilities are. Does everybody know their final project groups? Does everybody know who's in their group? Okay. You got to do that by November 9th. I want to know who's going to be delivering which piece of the final project, or who's going to be accountable for which piece of the final project within your team. And that's because, I want to make sure, even if you have a team member who might not be doing their part, you don't suffer for it, so that you're accountable for one piece of that. And as long as that piece is good, your grade will be good on the group project. Okay. It does require some collaboration, but I wanted to protect people against the fact that they might have group members who are less than conscientious. So each group member should be associated with some subset of these roles on the project team. All right. The other thing you're going to be asked to do after November 2nd is you're going to execute the steps to build the Java app using SQL Server. And this one I'm not actually going to, it says 100 points. You're not going to get credit for that, because that's just something that's going to enable you to write a simple JDBC program. That's the real assignment, and that's going to be due November 18th. So you'll see that assignment, and you'll see the details of that assignment here. Essentially, you're going to print out a formatted version of the query that I just printed out. So you're going to have to use the get column name type of stuff and write it and edit the Java program that I give you to print it out in this nice formatted view rather than the view that I did, which was just record by record type. Does that make sense to everybody? So, I've given you that early so that you have a lot of time to work on it along with these other things. But, that's what you're going to be asked to do. And that's worth 200 points because you need to, essentially prepare your PC to do that as well. There are some of you who are using the VMware version of our SQL Server. And you guys aren't going to have to execute the steps to build a Java app on SQL Server because we've already done that on the VMware version. So if anybody's having trouble doing this on their computer, you're perfectly welcome to get an account on the VMware version and do it there if you prefer. Okay. But you have to do one or the other because you'll need to do one or the other of those two things in order to write the JDBC program. That's the assignment for the 18th. The last thing I want to mention is we're going to have our second exam on November 11th. That's going to cover introductory and intermediate SQL. It's not going to cover advanced SQL, the JDBC stuff. Okay, but that exam is going to be November 11th. Okay. And, for the folks who are remote or otherwise unable to take the test in the class, you will get information from me on how you need to take that test. Okay. All right. Any questions or comments? This is a lot of stuff, but it's also several weeks. We've got a couple of weeks in which this is done. So please take a look and make sure that you know what you need to do and when. Okay. And we'll call it a day. And I expect to have your assignments graded by the end of today for those of you who have already submitted the SQL commands, and we will go over that on Thursday. Oh, one more thing, I'm sorry. Next week, we're gonna have a visitor here on Tuesday to observe the class. So just be aware that there'll be our assistant dean sitting in the back, watching me to make sure I don't misinform you guys too badly. All right, have a great day. Great, Andrew, good to be here. You too. You too, Hannah, you too, Nicole. All right, have a good day, everybody. Hold on, yeah, I'll see you at 1:30. Yeah, Michael, you'll have the recording will have that in it.